We're delighted to welcome you to the First Amendment Center and the Seigenthaler Center. This whole series of events have been rich and rewarding, and this one may be the highlight of the 2 years we've done this. As you know, the series honors John Seigenthaler, who valued freedom of speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly in his heart's heart and fought for it his entire life. And we love the fact that we have so many heroes of the First Amendment here, and tonight our guest is certainly that, especially in terms of freedom of the press. He is now a senior fellow in foreign policy, the foreign policy program at Brookings. He is also the senior advisor at the Pulitzer Center on crisis reporting. And so many of you know him as an outstanding journalist who worked for CBS and NBC News. And you just look at his remarkable career. This is a man who began with Edward R. Murrow, and near a later point in his career became prominent on Richard Nixon's enemies list. For most of us, that would be a career. You could just retire right then and then show off at your high school reunion. But no, this man went on to a continuing career and has been a thoughtful commentator, critic, author on all things media, and we are honored to have him with us today. Please welcome MARVIN KALB. This man is also an author, and that's why we're here today. Animate the People: Trump's War on the Press, the New McCarthyism, and the Threat to American Democracy. We're delighted to have you here, MARVIN. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired this new book, other than the obvious?
I had written 15 other books which I enjoyed writing, but this was not a work of happiness. I have to tell you, this is the first time in my life as a reporter, and I've been at it now for more than 60 years, but this is the first time in my life when I am frightened by the person who is President of the United States. I am frightened about what he is doing to this country and what he may yet do to this country. And on February 17th, 2017, I was planning to do a talk about journalism at the Cosmos Club, a club in Washington, D.C. And I got a call from a friend of mine at the White House. I have one or two friends at the White House. And one of them called me and said, you're going to do this speech about journalism. Yeah. Do you realize what the president's going to be saying tonight? I said, I have no idea what he's going to be saying. He said, well, he's going to call the press, the American press, the enemy of the people. And for a moment, I thought I was hearing something wrong. And then I put the phone down in a state of shock and deep unhappiness. My first assignment in Moscow was in 1956. In February of that year, Nikita Khrushchev, the communist leader, delivered a speech to the 20th Party Congress. He was denouncing Joseph Stalin. It came to be the secret speech, and it was a very important speech. One of the reasons Nikita Khrushchev, a communist, was denouncing Stalin, another communist, was that Stalin had used the expression enemy of the people to go after anyone who had any kind of criticism of him, his policy, the Soviet Union. You were an enemy of the people, that meant death. And I was saying to myself, wait a sec, a communist does not like the idea of another communist leader using the expression enemy of the people, and here I am, a citizen of this country. I fought for this country. I am proud of this country, and my president, I didn't vote for him, but he's still my president, is calling the press the enemy of the people. I was in a state of shock. And almost immediately, I felt the need to do something, but I didn't know what. And I then began to talk to a lot of people, think about the issue. And then I realized that what can an old man do? The only thing I felt I could do would be to write. And so I sat down and in a period of probably 3 months, wrote the book. And then you go through the editing process, starting with your wife, by the way. Always have a wife who believes she is the finest editor in America. and you're in trouble. I was. But what she did was oblige me to answer the question, why does this upset you so much? What is it about it? It's just another expression. Politicians do this all the time. And what bothered me about it is something that goes back to Ed Murrow. Murrow was for me an idol. I practically worshiped the man. He is the one who hired me in June of 1957. Probably one of his great mistakes, but he hired me thinking that I knew something about the Soviet Union, spoke Russian, that he would send me back for CBS to cover that country, which I did, and I enjoyed the experience a lot. Murrow and I was privileged to have many conversations with him. In one of the conversations, he told me about something that he had learned from an Oxford Don just before World War II broke out. The Oxford Don asked him, Ed, what is your definition of freedom? Ed answered, democracy. Not good enough, he said. Spell that out. And Murrow, who had covered the rise of Hitler and knew a great deal about the power of evil when it is let loose. And Murrow said that democracy to him was just a word. And I began to think about that, just a word, and Murrow's explanation was, we all place certain values on words. If the words do not in themselves have an intrinsic value, which we as citizens vest in the word is meaningless and like a leaf in a wind can just float away. It has meaning because in Ed's mind, and I want to go along for the ride here, there were two pillars that kept democracy in play in a society. One pillar was what Ed called the sanctity of the courts, meaning no person is above the law. And the other was freedom of the press. That if you have them both, you have your democracy. If either one of them is shaky, the other begins to shake as well. And then the concept of democracy is weakened. And I believed, listening to Trump and trying to figure out what's on his mind and talking to as many people as I could find who claimed to know him. Why would he use this kind of an expression? And why is he doing what he's doing with respect to the courts, the Department of Justice? Why think of the Attorney General? I don't particularly like the former Attorney General, we'll put that aside, but why think of him as your personal attorney? He isn't. He's the attorney for the nation. But Trump has a personalized style of democracy, believing that everything rotates around him, and that if you are part of that rotation, you are a good person. If you're out of that rotation, you are an enemy of the people. And I began to worry about that Murrow structure, about the courts being weakened, about the press and freedom of the press being weakened, and fearful that our democracy may be weakened. And I felt that I had to write the book. Sorry for going on.
No, it's excellent. I'm struck by how cynical the public is now about a free press. You mentioned 60 years. I've got roughly half that many years in the business. I look out and I see some people with 30 years, some with 20 years. Some of the best people I know are journalists. And yet the public is so ready to view the press as being anything but idealistic, being dark and being manipulative. And so let me just ask you this. 60 years ago, what motivated you to become a member of the Free Press? Surely it was not because you woke up one day and said, someday I want to be enemy of the people.
No, that is not why I did it. Part of the reason has already been explained. I have an older brother named Bernie. And Bernie was a reporter for the New York Times. And he would, on frequent occasions, bring his friends from the Times home for my mother's great cooking. And there would be Abe Rosenthal, who ended up being the editor of the Times, and Artie Gelb, who was a junior editor of the Times, and a lot of people like that, Gates Elise, people who were the Times people. They would end up in Bella Kalb's kitchen. And they loved her cooking, rightly so. And so that was always in my mind, that there was journalism. But that was not really what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to do was be a professor. I was hoping one day I could be a professor at Harvard. I wanted to teach Russian history, and I thought that would be paradise for me. But along came Murrow, and that remarkable experience I had with him. I had done a piece for the Times when I came back from Moscow the first time about Soviet youth. Murrow read it, liked it, called me into his office, and Kay Campbell, who was the secretary, said, "Young man, 30 minutes and no more." I was delighted to have 10 minutes with Murrow. And Murrow and I spoke for 3 hours, not because I did. He kept asking me questions about Russia, at the end of which he sort of looked up and said, "Oh, by the way, how would you like to work for CBS?" And I don't know what your feelings were about Murrow, but mine were, I was so struck by the whole thing that I could only think of saying, "Are you sure?" He said, yes, I would like you to be at CBS. I just said yes. So that was the end of being a professor and the beginning of being a journalist. But I always wanted to do something in the Murrow image, working in his shadow.
Well, let's go back to that era, the era in which you began your career, and a certain senator from Wisconsin,
Yes.
Joe McCarthy, who looms large in your book. And I think it's fair to say you see some direct parallels between Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump. For the folks in this room who might have been born after 1960, could you begin with a little description of McCarthy and his antics, and then talk about why you see a parallel?
Right. Joe McCarthy, Wisconsin, Republican, Midwestern conservative, drank too much, but so what? He ran for the Senate in 1946 and won, much to his surprise. He then was extremely anxious to be well known in Washington. He wanted stories to be written about him. He had an enormous ego, and he thought he was God's gift to America. But from the period of 46 to 1950, nothing happened. The press totally ignored him. And in February of 1950, Republican women from Wheeling, West Virginia, invited him to do their annual speech. And he went there. And he did a speech which was remarkable in one way especially. Toward the end of it, he pulled from his pocket a piece of paper, and he said, "On this sheet of paper, I have a list of 205 communists who are now working at the State Department. And this is a horrible thing, and we must stop this immediately." Well, there was a hush in the room. Everybody loved him. The men applauded phenomenally. The women practically kissed his tie. And he left that night, going back to Washington, thinking, wait a second, I've got something here. And he began then, time and time again, to hit this theme of there are communists hidden in the US government. We got to be terribly careful about that. And the theme took. We were then in the period, in the post-World War II period. There was the beginning of the Cold War. People were concerned about the Soviet Union. They did have nuclear weapons, just started. The war in Korea had just started. That was a little after the McCarthy speech. And the American people seemed ready to be concerned about the spread of communism in the United States. And McCarthy filled that bill and maliciously, cleverly, wickedly began consistently to hit that theme, and the press picked it up. And they began to run with it. And reporters for the Chicago Tribune said afterward, Joe McCarthy kept us on the front page. He was our ticket to the front page, and we grabbed it and ran with it. And this was not only in Chicago, it was all over. And the Washington press, led at that time still by the Post, began to just cover him. Everything he did began to be covered, so that when he opened up his mouth, it was the lead story on the evening news. And in that way, there's a comparison with Trump in that Trump also has that capacity. It's a work almost of PR genius to say something and immediately has every reporter eating out of his hand. And McCarthy had the same thing. McCarthy was good for a story, and Trump is good for a story. McCarthy began to do really dreadful things in Hollywood and New York, in the field of journalism, even in the field of medicine. He would find something where some disease was actually a communist germ that was planted into the American body politic. It was always a story, and Murrow, who had come back from Europe after World War II, CBS gave him a big kind of hoo-ha job, which he didn't like. And after a year and a half, he went and informed everybody that he didn't like that. He wanted to go back to being a reporter. But he wasn't just a reporter. He was a big man on campus. And Murrow was given a radio program, 7:45, 15 minutes every night, 5 nights a week. And then 6 months later, he was given a program called See It Now. He had a phenomenal producer, Fred Friendly, and the two of them made beautiful music together. And from 1951 until the beginning of 1954, Murrow was, I don't want to say obsessed, but he was drawn to the McCarthy story because of his fear that what he had seen in Germany in the 1930s was being duplicated in the United States in the early 1950s, and it frightened him. And he would tell me and others, and he would use that verb. He was frightened by what it is that the senator was doing. And he told everybody, we're going to do a broadcast one day. Not that we're going to get him, because he would never use words like that, but that would inform the nation truly of what it is that McCarthy represented. And that happened on, I believe, March 9th, 1954. And what's interesting is that up to that point, McCarthy was so popular all over the United States. He was the second most popular Republican in the nation, the number one obviously being Eisenhower, but he was the number two. And his numbers ran in Gallup polling between 46 and 50, which is not bad, not great, but not bad. Murrow did his program, which was remarkable in two ways. In one, it was a 30-minute program. 22 minutes of the 30 minutes were devoted exclusively to McCarthy speaking. Ed was not part of it. You didn't hear him or see him. You saw only McCarthy speaking and saying wild things. And then at the end, the second remarkable thing about the program was Murrow's Conclusion, which I urge you all with your fancy little telephones these days to go pick it up. March 9, 1954. It's a remarkable conclusion. It was powerful, delivered in his way. And McCarthy's polling numbers the following week dropped from 48 to 32 and stayed at 32 throughout the Army-McCarthy hearings, which took place immediately after Ed's program. So when you look back on it, the impact of the Murrow broadcast was phenomenal. The Army-McCarthy hearings sort of nailed it down, at the end of which 4 Republican senators who up to that point had been terrified of McCarthy and wouldn't say a word. Throughout that entire period, the Republican leadership of the Senate, you'll find a remarkable parallel here. The Republican leadership of the Senate did nothing to stop McCarthy. After the Murrow program, after the Army-McCarthy hearings, at that point, 4 of them felt they had the courage to stand up. They did, and 6 months later, McCarthy was censured.
So that begs the question, do we have a Murrow today?
We do not have a Murrow today. Journalism has changed so profoundly that we are unable to have any one journalist have the power that Murrow had at that time. Let me point out, it's kind of interesting, that Walter Cronkite, another great CBS personality, Walter in the early 1980s had an 83% approval rating in this country. 83%. And it was not, by the way, 83% for a journalist. It was for an American citizen. 83%. Think for a second today, what journalist could have a 13% approval rating? We can't. And the journalism has changed profoundly, but we as a nation have also changed a great deal. And we're now struggling to find our sea legs.
Stepping back to McCarthy for a minute, there's a chapter in your book where it refers to his raw wit and charm. Were there personality similarities with Trump as well?
Well, Trump, I have had the privilege of never meeting him. So I cannot speak from personal experience. But I have interviewed dozens and dozens of people who claim to know him. Trump is capable of charm, the way McCarthy was capable of charm. McCarthy, unlike Trump has a German background. McCarthy had a light, wonderful Irish quality to him, which was charming. I remember as a kid reporter being at a news conference, but just being one of hundreds looking at him. And you could tell he was charming, but at the same time, he was capable of flipping and being very nasty very suddenly. Trump does not have that kind of charm at all. He is capable, I am told, when he needs you, of leaning on you in the way that Lyndon Johnson could lean on you, tower over you and sort of frighten you a bit. Trump, unlike Johnson, has aims that are much more personal. Johnson had aims that were national. What I am told time and time again, Trump is not a nice man. If you want a favor, he is not the guy you turn to. But that is not, I have to quickly, I don't want to leave people with the wrong impression. That is totally irrelevant to me. What is relevant is that what he is doing may be in the process of weakening and damaging the democracy in this country that I have lived with all of my life, that I am very proud of. I've spent an awful lot of time, you have, Charlie has, a lot of other reporters have, running around the world. We have a sense of what the world is like, and we have a sense of what America is like. And I can tell you that up until Trump, there was never a doubt in my mind about the wonder of this country in comparison to any other. I love going to Italy. I love Florence. I love Venice. I love Paris. I love London. But America is separate. But now, as I said before, I am frightened by what this president has done and what he may yet do.
Your book has an intriguing theory about the origins of Enemy of the People, and we want to get to that. But I will tell you, when I first heard Enemy of the People, it immediately conjured up Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon to me. The Nixon White House did not want Spiro around, so they basically made him an attack dog, sent him out of the White House, and he attacked the press and professors and anyone who fancied themselves as informed or intellectual, and he really didn't like young people with their long hair and attitude, and that was his role. That was his role before his being charged with bribery as governor of Maryland. I mention that as often as I can in as many public places as I can. And I have to confess, I still have an attitude about Spiro Agnew. But having said that, he seemed to me Agnew was the first to actually kind of master the attack on the press and teach it to thousands of other politicians. Can you talk a little bit about whether Nixon and Agnew are the forerunners to this, whether they inspired it in any way, and what you saw firsthand as a member of the enemies list?
Richard Nixon did not like my reporting on Vietnam. That's the beginning and the end of the story. So how did he respond? He had an enemies list, which was a private White House list. The people at the White House, only a few of them, about a half dozen, knew of the existence of the list, and they and Nixon would sit down every now and then and say, you know that Ken Paulson, he's a bad guy, we ought to put him on. Yeah, let's put him on. And it would be kind of a game that they would play among themselves. It meant nothing. As a matter of fact, I regard it now as a sign of honor. I was on Nixon's enemies list. But it didn't amount to a hill of beans. It was an odd kind of honor to have. Richard Nixon, whom I did cover, never frightened me. Richard Nixon was an insecure, bright, in many ways talented negotiator, a skilled mind, understanding the world and the balance of power, dealing with Russia, dealing with China. He understood a great deal. I don't have any of that with respect to Trump. I don't believe that Trump, even in office for 2 years, knows what Richard Nixon has forgotten or had forgotten in 2 months. Trump is the sort of person, as president, and if I didn't say this before, let me say it again, his instinct is the protection of self and immediate family structure. Nixon thought first about the United States of America. There was a different mindset. He had won a seat in the House, in the Senate. He was vice president for 2 terms, and then president. He had done everything. He was a highly experienced man. Trump had not even been a PFC in the U.S. Army.
My experience in the business has always been post-Nixon. So there was always a segment of society that hated me on principle. But was there a day in 1959, 1963, where you felt like the world felt good about your profession, admired you, respected you, wanted you to date their daughter, all those things?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my father-in-law did want me to date his daughter. No, I was proud to be a journalist, and I am prouder today to be a journalist than I have ever been before, because the pressures that these guys are working under now is phenomenal. I mean, think about Jim Acosta, whom I don't know, but just to watch him on the news. He is an accomplished cable news correspondent, no question about that. And the criticism of him is that every now and then he seems to be grandstanding it. Maybe he is, so what? The important thing is that he is asking tough questions. Sam Donaldson asked tough questions. Helen Thomas asked tough questions. There are always reporters asking tough questions. That's what they do. They are not enemies. They are part of the system. It is their job to ask questions, and the tougher the better. So my sense is that I had always felt incredibly proud of being a journalist. I thought and still think it is the best job in the world. And when I stand in front of classes, quite often up at the Kennedy School, at Georgetown, at GW, at Johns Hopkins, yes, I speak with pride about having been a journalist and what it is that journalists today do, because I think they are the ones who are going to save us all.
In your book, an old name pops up, a name that I associated with the Carter administration, Pat Caddell. And you see Pat as maybe the font from which this enemy of the people came from.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of story. Pat Caddell was a very experienced pollster. He worked for Jimmy Carter. If you ask Pat, he will tell you right now that he is responsible for Jimmy's victory in 1976. But Pat was always at that time a man of the left. No question about that. He is now dramatically a man of the right, way over on the right. And starting about 10 years ago, he began to look for places where he could put his ideas. And one of them was Breitbart, the alt-right website. And the man who eventually became the head of that was Steve Bannon, who went over to work at the White House for President Trump. Pat Caddell began to write stories about the press, which were kind of interesting. There was a central theme that has emerged in the last couple of years, and that is that the American press has become elitist, detached from the public, unable truly to understand what the public feels. And in that elite status, they have become the enemy of the people. And he came up with that expression. I never had the occasion, maybe it was a shortage of wit on my part, but I never had the occasion of finding out whether he knew anything about the origin of that expression when he used it. But he used it on radio, on Breitbart radio, and then on 2 or 3 long, tortured pieces that he wrote about the press and the elite status, the detached, this kind of thinking of the press as an evil force removed from reality. And he used that expression over and over again. Bannon loved it. So Bannon picked it up and began to talk about it at the White House. And the president listened, liked it, and figured one day he would use it. But the expression he liked even more was fake news. And he kept on saying time and time again, and I quote him once in the book, that the fake news is really a sacco expression. It really accomplishes a lot, and enemy of the people does not. And yet the other day when he had that argument with Acosta, standing there looking down at the American press, he looked at the reporter in the first row, CNN reporter, and said, "You are an enemy of the people."
We want to turn to all of you in this room to ask questions in just a minute. I want to ask, but let me just transition this way. I have to wonder, we can blame Trump, we can blame politicians, but when Americans believe falsehoods, don't they bear some responsibility for this? Are we gullible as a people?
Yes, I think that we are gullible as a people, but we live in a very tricky time now when that quality is made even more vulnerable by the nature of the technology in which we live our lives today. Everything, because of the introduction of the internet, everything has been accelerated dramatically. Your capacity to get somewhere accelerated. Ideas are instantaneous and universal. Dopier they are, it doesn't make any difference. They'll attract an audience. And they will generally attract an audience not of normal people, but of people who are drawn to sort of very unusual, odd statements, ideas, pictures, nuttiness. And I think that that is exacerbated by the new technology, and the idea of being a sucker for a thought is made easier by the new technology. And President Trump, when he became president, not even 2 years, when he became president, he had a tweet account of 17 million people. That's a lot. You know what it is today? 55 million. In other words, the president, when he has something to say, you asked sort of before about another Murrow, the president today has his own network. So if he has something to say, he doesn't need CBS any longer. As a matter of fact, in a private conversation, but Ted is, with Ted Koppel, Ted has talked about this in public, so I can say it. Ted was talking to him, and Trump said to him, I don't need you guys anymore. I have my own network. I get through the American people. And he said, when I'm finished, it'll be 70, 80 million. So we are at a time now where a president in office or out of office can be very mischievous in his use of the new technology, and that new technology could be put to very negative use and positive, but in the hands of the wrong people, negative.
We're joined tonight by Deborah Fisher, who is the overseer, coordinator, director of the Seigenthaler Chair of Excellence in First Amendment Studies at Middle Tennessee State University. I know that she's willing to take this microphone from me and go into the audience and get your questions. I want to emphasize Mr. Kalb has some very clear and strong views about Donald Trump, and it's engaging to hear from him. But I also want to tell you, if you are a Trump supporter in the audience, we would like to hear from you. That's the nature of the First Amendment Center. We embrace all views and the give and take of the marketplace of ideas. So if you have questions, comments, the floor is open.
I'd love to get your assessment of these election results that just have happened. In many ways, there's been a rebuke to Donald Trump. The House has gone to the Democrats, even though the Senate maintains in Republican hands. We're still having all these recounts, and the courts have continued to obstruct President Trump's agenda throughout these last 2 years. The failing New York Times is more successful than ever, and more media organizations like USA Today, like others, are growing and are becoming more successful under this Trump era. Do you have any hope for what that means for us in the future and what these results mean for the future?
It is an absolute fact that Donald Trump is a terrific story. He was a story when he first started in 2015, and he's even more of a story today. And it's very difficult for a reporter to ignore that story. If there's one question I get asked more than just about any other, is what can the press do at this point? As if the press stands as this giant at the barricades and is going to be victorious in everything it tries to do. No. I hope that it just continues to do a good job. And that's what is happening. But because Trump is such hot copy, he gets on the news constantly. And people are saying, why do you cover him so much? Why don't you just ignore some of the things that he says? Or don't put him at the beginning of the program, put him halfway into the program, because you've got to get at this guy by way of his ego. Totally unrealistic in my judgment. And I think that so long as he is president, he will retain that power. I know that there are people who believe that Trump will eventually lose that kind of power. I don't believe that. there are certain kinds of personalities that are drawn to power in a highly personalized way, and once they have it, are not giving it up. Let us say that the special counsel has dynamite on Trump, and one day soon, and I think it's going to happen soon, he puts it out. And it's very damaging. What is Trump going to do? How will he respond to that? One way that it is possible he may respond is to stand up and say, I have said from the very beginning that Mueller is a hoax. It's not a real thing that he did, and it's not true. It's fake news. There'll be a lot of people who will say, there goes Trump again. And I bet there will be a lot of people who will say, you know, he's got something there. In other words, what I am saying is that we are dealing with a fascinating, troubled personality, now president, and the consequences of the way he thinks, the way he responds, the use of Twitter, what he did in France this weekend. I cannot imagine a president of the United States at the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War going to France in order to pay his respects to the Americans who died there, not going to the cemetery when he was supposed to. And the White House putting out the line that it was raining.
Hi, this is Theresa Melby. What is your opinion of Fox News and Murdoch?
In the interest of truth in packaging, for 5 years I was a commentator at Fox, but during the day, not at night. That was part of the contract. In February of 2016, I quit and sent a letter to Roger Ailes saying that you guys have become a propaganda arm of the Republican Party, and I thought you were a news organization. And so I'm leaving. And Roger, I must say, put up no fight. I was perfectly fine that I left. And I felt good and he felt good. Fox has been two worlds from the very beginning. There's one world that exists during the day, and there's one world very early in the morning and throughout the night. It is a conscious decision that they make. Roger Ailes, whom I knew, was a brilliant, brilliant man. He understood the American people in a way that few did. He was a master at looking in and finding the soft underbelly. He knew where to go. He knew how to do it. He knew how to hire young women who looked a certain way. In Roger's mind, if you were blonde, blue-eyed, smart, and could talk good, Roger would hire you right out of college. I mean, that was fine. He didn't care about experience or knowledge. When you had somebody like Megyn Kelly, smart as can be, except every now and then she goes off the deep end. But when she and I were in a conversation, it was like having a conversation with Eric Sevareid. She is really smart, well-read, she knows a lot. But she, because of money, I believe, was drawn into the nighttime world of Fox, where Hannity is and Ingram is, and that those people live in one world, and Bear and Chris sort of live in another world. And they're split apart. They are now in crisis, however, because of something that Hannity did last week, when he stood up with the president at a rally. In other words, that lost the pretense that he was a journalist. And a lot of people at Fox were very disturbed by that. And there's a big civil war at the moment. How it ends, I don't know. In 1996, Roger had in his mind that there are a bunch of people out there who do not believe that we lost the Vietnam War, and who are absolutely convinced that the press lost it, and who are convinced further that Watergate was just that guy Bernstein. He's the one who did it. He toppled the president. Woodward didn't really want to go along with that story at all, but it was Bernstein that made him do it. That there were those people out there, and if we fed them what they think is America, we're going to get a big audience. That's exactly what he did, and it became incredibly successful.
When something particular happens, like the Acosta thing, there are calls in some circles for collective action by the White House press corps in some way to do something about that particular narrow arena of press activity.
When the White House takes an action, such as denying press credentials to an established reporter who covers the White House, that requires a collective cry of anguish. But after you have had your cry of anguish, get back to your job and just cover the news. I don't think that you have to go to war with the president. I mean, the book has a subtitle, Trump's War on the Press. That's Trump's war on the press. It's not the press's war on Trump. So far as I'm concerned, the press should cover Trump. And I think they're doing a terrific job. I do not believe in concerted press action to do this or that. I'm very nervous about that. Just do your job. You're doing an important enough job that you don't have to add politics to it.
Apart from Nixon and Trump, have there been any other presidents who had such an adversarial relationship with the press?
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson. But Lyndon Johnson was, I was telling some people outside before, I think Lyndon Johnson was one of the great presidents in American history, were it not for the Vietnam War, which absolutely destroyed him. But he was able to do certain things in domestic policy that took guts and political skill, and he had both, and he accomplished them. But Lyndon, at the same, I say Lyndon because that was my mindset then, at that time he was also capable, and I'll give you an exact example. I did a piece, going from where the camera was at CBS to my office took about 20 seconds. It was about the Vietnam War, and it was about our policy. And it was a negative piece. I'm aware of that. When I say negative, I mean I am pointing out something that was failing in the policy. By the time I got to my office, the phone was ringing. And because I'm a bit of a witch, I had a feeling it was Johnson. And I picked up the phone, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs. I cannot quote him directly because there are ladies in the room. He was outrageous in what he said, outrageous. And when he was finished cursing me and saying, the life of the American kids who are dying tonight in Vietnam on your conscience. And then he hangs up on me. I was trembling. I really was. I remember I was trembling. And I went home, and in those days I would have a scotch. I used to enjoy drinking scotch. I had two immediately. I was trembling. The following morning, I got in early, and there was a note, call Walt. Walt was Walt Rostow, who was the National Security Advisor. Walt Rostow, whom I knew from Harvard, never called me. Never. Call Walt. So I called Walt. Marvin, he said, as if we're the greatest buddies, why don't you come over to the White House? I want to show you something. So I went over, walked into his office, this big semicircular desk there. On that desk was a large map of North Vietnam, stamped top secret. He said, come here, I want to show you what we're going to hit tonight. I said, it says top secret, I'm not going over there. He said, come on, the president wants you to see this. short end of this. I would not go over to do that. But it shows that Lyndon Johnson cursed me and then wanted to give me a story the next day. So he called me in to do that. Trump would not do that. It is a different mindset, an important difference, I think.
On the idea of the press being the enemy of the people, what do you think about the way the press treated Trump during his campaign when they gave him enormous amounts of free coverage, sometimes interrupting other news to show his rallies? I can't help thinking that the role that the press played in that period was actually against the Republic.
Two answers to that. Number one, your use of the word press. It was not the entire press that did it. It was cable news that did it. So we got to isolate the culprit here. Having isolated the culprit, I totally agree with you. And the statistics, not of cable news, but on CBS, ABC, NBC, the evening news programs, during the 2016 campaign, the networks gave 1,100 and something minutes of free time to Trump, 530 something minutes to Clinton. Trump had twice as much. Why? It goes to the point I was making to another question earlier. He is hot copy. He was then, and he remains it today. He has an extraordinary capacity of a great huckster. Burt Lancaster in that marvelous movie, I forgot what it was called, where you could take a negative thing and turn it around and make people become enchanted by it. Trump has that capacity, that skill, which every modern politician needs. He's got it in spades, and he uses it to great advantage.
Given the fact that when you started with Mr. Murrow, the news division was a separate division, didn't necessarily have to worry about advertising revenues, and that's no longer the case. This question that I'm asking myself that I don't know how to answer the question, and I think the press has to help me, is why do people support this man?
I cannot give you a better answer than I tried to do earlier. Trump is just good copy and they're going to cover him. We are benefiting enormously by the work that the press is doing right now. We don't have enough respect for what it is that the press does on a regular basis every day. Everyone in this room has an exaggerated view of what the press is supposed to do. The press is there to cover the news and to find out as best it can what's going on and report that. And I think that if you read people like Peter Baker at the Times or Philip Rucker of the Washington Post, both of whom are bureau chiefs, White House bureau chiefs for their respective newspapers, those guys are doing a phenomenal job. And a lot of other reporters are doing the same thing. I don't particularly like the cable news business, but I am aware that many of the people who speak on the nightly programs work very hard, do a very good job. I am not placing the Fox nighttime people here. That is, in my judgment, propaganda. But that doesn't mean that a conservative cannot express his or her opinion. And some of them do and do it very well. I could tick off about a dozen names now of conservative columnists who do a fine job. I don't have to agree with them to respect their capacity to be first-rate reporters and do good work. And I think that the press deserves a pat on the back every morning and every night rather than a spanking.
It still seems that we have to do more to regain the trust from people. So what do you think we need to do, our outlets need to do to regain that trust? Because outside of this room, I mean, in this room, everyone believes in the First Amendment, but outside of this room, there might be people that they might not care that much about it. So What can we do to regain the trust from them?
The time when you appreciate the First Amendment and what it does for us as a people and a nation is when you don't have it. I was blessed with, my first assignment was in the Soviet Union, where the idea of a First Amendment in those days was the thought of a madman. And they didn't have it, but they didn't have freedom either. And that really, if there's a central message I would like to leave tonight, is that it is not for us as a people to stand back and criticize the press endlessly. Why? Because it's what we see and it's what we read, and they're so visible and so obvious a target. It is at the same time to appreciate what it is to be a journalist, to be an editor, to be a producer of an evening news program. What goes into that? The reporters who are tonight sneaking around in Kabul somewhere to try to find what's going on, those people are putting their lives on the line. They don't have to do it. They would just be able to broadcast the next day and say spokesman X said blah, 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 and they've covered the story. But that's not good enough, because most of them will go out and try to find more. And that skill, that energy, that determination to dig further into the worst parts of a society, into a war, into corruption, and point it out to the American people. That is what they do every single day. And they deserve to be patted on the back time and again. And I personally am fed up with the people who sit back in cheap criticism of the press without having a clue as to what it is that the press does regularly in their interest.
Very well said. Mr. Baker, I thank you for your question. If I could, given this is the final one of the 8 Seigenthaler Series events, I just want to interject a personal comment. I know there's a perception that there's the far left and the far right, but the far left is 1%, the far right is 1%, and 98% are people like the editors and reporters we have in this room from the Tennessean, people who get up every day to try to do the job that they believe will benefit their community. And I don't know how we fix that, but eloquent words like that help us in that good fight. I've been an educator, I have been a lawyer, not a very good one, and I've been a journalist, and I will tell you the strongest ethics code of those 3 by far is American journalism. I see it looking out here, our chair of the journalism school at Middle Tennessee State University is here, Dr. Greg Pitts, and I can tell you with confidence that our great hope is that every student who attends our program and graduates with a degree in journalism will grow up to be just like Marvin Kalb. Thank you so much for being here.